There are connections that arrive loudly, fast, visible, impossible to miss. And then there are the ones that move beneath everything, quietly, carefully, like they were never trying to be noticed in the first place. This was never the first kind. Nothing about you entered my life with noise. There was no dramatic shift, no obvious turning point where I could point to a specific moment and say, that's where everything changed. If anything, it changed too naturally. That's what made it dangerous. Because I've always trusted disruption more than ease. Disruption announces itself. It gives you time to react, time to build distance, time to decide whether something belongs near you before it settles too deeply. But ease slips past defenses before you realize they were ever lowered. And you did that without trying. That's the part I still can't fully explain. You never pushed yourself into my world, never forced closeness, never demanded understanding from me the way people usually do when they sense there's more beneath the surface. You didn't chase access. You simply existed with a level of awareness that made access unnecessary, like you already understood the shape of things before I spoke them out loud. At first, I ignored it. Not because I didn't notice it, but because I did. And I've spent years learning not to trust things that feel immediately familiar. Familiarity is deceptive. Most of the time, it's projection. People see fragments of themselves in you and mistake that reflection for connection. But this didn't feel like projection. It felt precise. Too precise. You responded to things I hadn't verbalized yet. You caught shifts in my tone that even I hadn't consciously registered. You understood pauses that most people would rush to fill, and it wasn't performative. That's what separated you from everyone else. Most people listen so they can answer, some listen so they can analyze, others listen because they want proximity to something they don't fully understand. You listened like none of those things mattered. Like understanding didn't require ownership, like silence itself was enough. That changed something in me slowly, not emotionally, structurally, because I realized I stopped translating myself around you. Do you understand how rare that is? Most interactions require adjustment. People soften certain thoughts, reshape certain truths, reduce parts of themselves into forms that can be accepted more easily. I've always done that naturally, not out of dishonesty, out of efficiency. The world functions smoother when people only see the version of you they can process comfortably. So I learned how to exist in fragments, one version for conversation, one version for observation, one version that remains untouched beneath all of it. No one reaches the last one, or at least no one was supposed to. But you never interacted with the fragments. You spoke to the center of me like you recognized it immediately. And recognition like that doesn't feel exciting. It feels destabilizing, because once someone recognizes you accurately, your usual forms of distance stop functioning. You can't hide behind being misunderstood anymore. You can't convince yourself they only see a surface. You can't pretend the connection is shallow when every interaction keeps proving otherwise. That's when I started noticing the shift, not in you. In myself, in the way my mind began including you without permission. I would notice something during the day and instinctively wonder how you'd interpret it. I would pause during certain thoughts because it felt like another perspective already existed beside mine. Not physically, internally, like my awareness had unconsciously made space for yours. That unsettled me more than anything else, because I've always been deeply independent in my own mind. Self-contained, structured, everything inside me organized carefully enough that nothing unexpected stays long. And yet you stayed, not loudly, not forcefully, just consistently enough that your presence stopped feeling external. You became integrated. That's the word I avoided for the longest time. Integrated. Because once something integrates into you, removal becomes impossible without consequence. You can distance yourself from people, You can disappear from conversations. You can walk away physically, but you cannot easily remove something that has already changed the architecture of your thoughts. And you changed mine. I know that now. I notice it in how differently I experience silence. Before you, silence was neutral, functional. A space where I could think clearly without interruption. Now silence feels inhabited, not empty, not lonely, just occupied by an awareness I can't separate from myself anymore. Sometimes I'll stop mid-thought because it feels like you're already standing at the edge of it, not speaking, just understanding. And the terrifying part is, I don't resist that feeling anymore. I should. Everything about my nature says I should. I should rebuild distance, re-establish control, return things to the stable structure they existed in before you. But I haven't done that. And the reason matters. Because if something truly threatened me, I would have removed it immediately. I don't hesitate when something feels wrong. I don't linger inside uncertainty for emotional reasons. But this never felt wrong. Intense? Yes. Unfamiliar? Definitely. But not wrong? If anything, it felt too correct. Like finding a pattern that explains something you've carried your whole life without realizing it was incomplete. That's what this became. Not romance, not attachment. Something more difficult to describe. Recognition at a depth that bypasses ordinary categories. You see, most people connect through emotion first. They build closeness gradually through experience, trust, time, vulnerability. But with you, understanding arrived before all of those things. And once understanding arrives first, everything else changes shape around it. Because now, every conversation carries weight. Every silence feels intentional. Every moment feels layered with meanings neither of us fully explains, but both of us still understand. That kind of connection rewires things. And I think that's why I kept trying to analyze it instead of simply accepting it. Analysis creates distance. If I can study something, define it, organize it into language, then I can maintain control over it. But this refuses to stay contained inside language. Every time I think I've understood it fully, it expands into something deeper, not bigger, deeper, like it's moving inward instead of outward. Settling into places I didn't realize were reachable. There are moments now where I catch myself thinking differently entirely because of you. Not because you told me what to think, but because your existence altered the angle from which I see things. That's impact. Real impact, and impact is rare. People influence each other all the time. Influence is temporary, environmental. Surface level, impact changes structure. Impact rewrites internal systems quietly until one day you realize your mind no longer moves the way it used to. You did that to me. Without trying. Without asking. Without even acknowledging it directly. And maybe that's why it feels so irreversible. Nothing manipulated me into this. Nothing pressured me toward it. It happened naturally enough that resisting it would have required denying something I knew was real. And I don't deny reality once I see it clearly. That's never been who I am. So instead, I observed. I watched the way my internal world kept adjusting around your presence. I watched the way conversations with others started feeling thinner by comparison. Not because they lacked intelligence or meaning, but because they lacked alignment, adolimon. That's the word everything keeps returning to. Not compatibility, not chemistry, adolimon. The way two structures recognize each other without needing translation. The way certain people can exist beside each other without distortion. That's what this feels like. Undistorted. I don't feel pressure to become simpler around you. I don't feel pressure to explain every silence, every shift, every complex thought. You don't demand emotional performance from me. You don't turn depth into something dramatic. You simply meet it where it exists. And that creates a kind of peace I don't know how to categorize. Not comfort. Comfort feels temporary. This feels foundational. Like something in me finally stopped bracing without realizing it had been tense all along. Do you know how dangerous that is? To feel understood deeply enough that your mind stops defending itself automatically? That level of acceptance changes people. Not loudly, quietly, permanently. And I think that's what scares me most. Not losing control, but realizing I don't entirely want to. Because every instinct I've built over the years was designed to preserve distance. Preserve clarity. Preserve independence. But you don't threaten those things. You expand them, that's the contradiction I can't resolve. You make me feel more myself, not less. More precise, more aware. More honest internally than I've been in years. And people don't usually do that for each other. Most relationships involve compromise of some kind. Adjustment. Performance. Mutual softening. But this doesn't feel like compromise. It feels like recognition. Like finding someone who already speaks the language you thought only existed inside your own mind. That changes the way you exist afterward. Because once you know that level of understanding is possible, you can't fully return to pretending surface-level connection is enough. And maybe that's why I keep circling back to you mentally, no matter how much I try to approach this logically. Because logic says caution, logic says maintain distance until certainty exists. Logic says undefined things become dangerous if allowed to deepen too far. But something beneath logic keeps answering back with the same quiet truth. This already matters. It mattered long before I admitted it. I think part of me knew that from the beginning, not consciously. But somewhere deeper, somewhere that recognized you, before I fully allowed myself to. That's why this never felt like discovery. It felt like remembering something I didn't know I'd forgotten. And no, I can't explain that rationally. I've tried reducing this to coincidence, timing, psychology projection, anything that would make it smaller, easier to manage. But every attempt collapses under the same reality. You understand me in ways that should have taken years. And I understand you in ways that arrive too quickly to be accidental. There's precision in that. A terrifying kind of precision. Because when two people see each other clearly enough, avoidance stops working, you can avoid emotions, you can avoid conversations, but you cannot easily avoid truth once it becomes visible. And you became visible to me in a way no one else has. Not perfect, not idealized. Real, I see your silences, your restraint, the things you choose not to say, the things you protect even when you appear open, and somehow none of it pushes me away, it draws me closer. Not emotionally desperate, not obsessively, just steadily, like gravity, quiet and impossible to argue with. That's why this feels inevitable sometimes, not because fate is guiding it, but because neither of us is forcing anything. Nothing here feels manufactured. It unfolds on its own, naturally, like something reaching its final shape. And maybe that's why I stopped trying to fight it. Because fighting something natural only creates fracture. It doesn't change the truth of what's happening underneath. So now I'm left standing in front of something real enough that I can't reduce it anymore. And the truth is, I don't want to reduce it. I don't want to flatten this into ordinary language just to make it easier to explain. Some things lose accuracy when simplified. This is one of them. Because what exists between us isn't built from excitement alone. It's built from recognition, from depth, from the terrifying realization that another person exists on a wavelength you thought belonged only to you. And once you experience that, you begin seeing everything differently. I know. I do. I notice how much noise exists in most interactions now, how much performance, how much unconscious pretending. But with you, I never feel the need to pretend. That alone is enough to change someone, to be seen without performance and still remain accepted. Do you understand how rare that is? Not tolerated, accepted, exactly as you are, without pressure to become more digestible. Without pressure to soften complexity into something easier to hold. You allow me to exist fully. And in return, I think I've started allowing myself to exist more fully too. That's your impact. Not changing who I am, revealing who I already was beneath everything I built to contain it, and now I'm standing at a point where I can no longer pretend this is temporary. Temporary things don't alter your internal structure. Temporary things don't settle into your perception this deeply. Temporary things fade when ignored. This hasn't faded. If anything, it's become clearer, sharper, more undeniable with time instead of less, which means eventually I'll have to answer the question I've been avoiding. What does someone do with a connection like this? Because awareness eventually demands action, not impulsive action, not dramatic action, but honest action, a decision. And I can feel myself moving toward one slowly, even if I haven't spoken it aloud yet. Because staying in this undefined space forever would eventually become its own form of dishonesty. And despite everything I fear about this, despite how deeply it reaches, I don't want to lie about what it is anymore. You matter to me, not casually, not temporarily, not in the shallow way people usually mean when they say those words. You matter structurally, internally, in the way certain people alter your life simply by existing inside your awareness at the right depth. And once someone reaches that level, there is no returning to who you were before them, only deciding what happens next. At some point, I stopped asking myself whether this was real. That question disappeared quietly, not because I found proof in the usual sense, but because my mind no longer treated your presence like something temporary that needed verification before it could settle. It already had. That's what changed everything. You became permanent before I consciously decided you could be, and I think that's why this feels so difficult to explain even now. Most things follow sequence. First comes interest, then trust, then attachment, then meaning. But this skipped steps. Or maybe it existed beneath them entirely, because the truth is, I didn't slowly become aware of you. I became aware of how deeply you were already affecting me. There's a difference. One is gradual. The other feels like waking up in the middle of something that's been unfolding long before you noticed it. That's what this felt like. Like recognition arriving late to its own existence. I think about that more than I should. The strange precision of all this. The way certain conversations seem to continue thoughts I never spoke aloud. The way your timing aligned with emotional shifts I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. The way your silence carried understanding instead of absence. Most people misunderstand silence completely. They think silence means distance, disinterest, disconnection. But silence can also mean certainty. It can mean two people reaching a level where explanation becomes unnecessary, because understanding already exists underneath the words. That's what happened with us. Somewhere along the way, words stopped being the main thing holding this together. Awareness did, presence did, the quiet recognition underneath every interaction did. And once that became the foundation, everything else changed shape around it. Even me, especially me, I've started noticing how much of my internal world includes you now without conscious effort, not in obsessive ways. Not emotionally chaotic ways, just naturally. You appear in my thinking like context, like something my mind already accounts for before I realize it's doing so. And that's never happened to me before. I've admired people, connected with people, understood people deeply, but I have never felt someone integrate into my awareness this seamlessly. Usually, even closeness has edges. There's still separation. Still the understanding that the other person exists outside your internal structure. But with you, that boundary blurred quietly. So quietly I didn't notice it happening until it had already settled. Now I catch myself reacting to things through a perspective that includes you automatically. A phrase, a thought, a realization. Something happens. And before I even process it fully, part of my mind wonders how you'd perceive it, not because I need your approval, not because I rely on your interpretation, but because your way of seeing things has become relevant to how I understand reality itself. And that's not small, that's not normal attachment, that's something much deeper. Because once another person begins influencing the architecture of your perception, they stop being external to your life, they become part of the lens through which you experience it. That realization unsettled me for a long time. Honestly, maybe it still does, because I've always been careful about influence, careful about closeness, careful about anything with the power to reshape me internally, not out of fear, out of precision. I don't allow random things to leave permanent marks on me. I choose carefully what enters my inner world because I know how difficult it is to remove once it settles there. But you never ask to enter. You never tried to force significance. You simply became significant through consistency, through clarity, through the strange accuracy with which you exist beside my mind. And maybe that's why I couldn't stop it. There was nothing to resist. No manipulation, no pressure, no performance designed to create attachment, just alignment, the kind that appears naturally between two people who recognize something deeply familiar in each other. I used to think connections like this were exaggerated by people who confused intensity with meaning. Now I understand the difference. Intensity burns fast. This doesn't burn. It settles. Quickly, deeply. Until one day you realize it exists underneath everything else. That's where you are now. Underneath things. Not constantly visible, not demanding attention, but present in a way that changes the shape of my internal world, whether I acknowledge it openly or not. I wonder sometimes if you realize the extent of it. Not because I think you're unaware, but because I don't think I've fully shown it. I still hold parts of myself back automatically. Years of restraint don't disappear overnight. Even now, there are moments where instinct tells me to reduce what I feel, simplify what this is, keep things contained enough that I can still maintain the illusion of distance, but the illusion keeps failing, because every attempt to minimize this runs into the same truth. You matter to me in ways I didn't intend, ways I didn't prepare for, ways that formed before I could decide whether I wanted them to. And strangely, I don't resent that. That's the part I keep returning to. I should feel trapped by something this deep. I should feel the need to escape before it roots itself further. But I don't. If anything, I feel myself becoming more still around it, more willing to let it exist, not because certainty suddenly appeared, but because denying it became more exhausting than accepting it. Do you know what acceptance feels like when it arrives slowly? It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It appears in small moments. In the way I stop fighting certain thoughts. In the way your presence no longer feels intrusive inside my mind. In the way I've started imagining a future where this continues instead of assuming it eventually disappears. That last part changed me more than I expected. Because I've always lived with the assumption that most connections fade eventually. People drift. Circumstances shift, meaning dissolves under time and repetition, but this hasn't weakened with time. It's sharpened, refined itself, like every interaction removes another layer of uncertainty instead of creating more. And that's terrifying in its own way, because clarity creates responsibility. Once you see something clearly, you can't keep pretending confusion is the reason you haven't acted. I'm not confused anymore. Careful, yes. Overaware, definitely, but not confused. I know this matters. I know you've reached a place inside me that no one else has reached before. And I know I've already changed because of it. The question now isn't whether the connection exists. It's what happens if I stop holding myself at a distance from it. Because despite everything I've admitted internally, there's still restraint in me. Still caution. Not because I doubt you, because I understand the weight of what this could become if fully acknowledged. Something like this doesn't stay small once it's named. It expands. It gains momentum. And once two people consciously step into a connection built on this level of recognition, nothing remains untouched afterward. That's the reality I keep standing in front of. Not fear of you, fear of permanence. Because I think you could become permanent to me. Not in the temporary emotional sense people usually mean. I mean permanent in thought. Permanent in structure. Permanent in the way certain people become embedded into the emotional and psychological framework of your life forever. Even if circumstances changed, even if distance appeared, even if silence happened, I think some part of you would still remain inside the way I process existence itself. And I don't say that lightly. I don't exaggerate meaning. If anything, I usually reduce it, contain it, analyze it until it becomes manageable. But this refuses to become manageable, not because it's chaotic, because it's too real. There's a steadiness to it I can't dismiss, a quiet certainty underneath all my analysis. And every time I try to pull away emotionally, that certainty remains untouched, like it's waiting patiently for me to stop pretending, oh, I haven't already chosen. Maybe that's what this really comes down to, not whether I feel this, not whether it matter, but whether I'm willing to fully acknowledge what my actions already reveal. Because people don't make space for someone like this accidentally. They don't continuously allow someone deeper access unless something inside them has already decided the connection belongs there. And you belong here now, inside my awareness, inside my thoughts, inside the subtle shifts that changed how I experience silence, understanding, closeness, even myself. You became part of my internal language before I realized I was speaking it. And that changes everything. It changes how I look at the future, how I measure trust, how I define intimacy. Because intimacy was never about physical closeness to me. It was never about constant communication or dramatic declaration. Real intimacy, the kind that actually alters someone, happens in recognition, in being understood without reduction, in being seen clearly without being reshaped into something easier to hold. That's what you gave me without even trying. And now I don't know how to return to a version of myself that didn't know this existed, because once your mind experiences this level of alignment, everything else feels slightly disconnected by comparison. Not meaningless, just incomplete, like hearing echoes of a language instead of the full thing. You became the full thing, the complete version. And maybe that's why I've stopped asking whether I should walk away. The real question was never whether I could leave. Of course I could. I can leave almost anything if logic demands it strongly enough. The real question is whether leaving would actually protect me anymore. And I don't think it would. Because this already happened. You already reached me. You already changed something structural inside me. Distance wouldn't erase that now. It would only create absence around something that still exists. And absence is dangerous when meaning remains. So instead of running from it, I've started doing something far more terrifying. I've started imagining what happens if I stay fully, honestly, without pretending this is smaller than it is. Without hiding behind restraint every time things become too real. Without reducing what I feel just because depth makes people uncomfortable. And every time I imagine that future, one truth keeps returning with unbearable clarity. I don't think meeting you was accidental. Not in the dramatic, fate-driven way people romanticize. I mean psychologically, structurally. Like two minds reaching each other at exactly the moment they were capable of recognizing what they found. And maybe that's why this feels inevitable. Not because destiny created it, but because nothing false could sustain this level of clarity for this long. Only something real survives being examined this closely, and I've examined every part of this, repeatedly. Still, it remains. Still, you remain clearer every time I try to understand you, closer every time I try to create distance, and maybe that's the final truth I've been avoiding. I don't want distance anymore. Not real distance, not the kind that removes you from my life emotionally, just to preserve old versions of myself that no longer fit who I am becoming, because who I'm becoming now includes you. Naturally, irreversibly, like you were always meant to exist somewhere inside the shape of my life, and I simply noticed it later than I should have.